Thank you for watching, and if you're interested in knowing more about the differences between using an SSD cache versus Qtier on your QNAP, and stay tuned for the rest of this video. If you haven't already done so, please hit subscribe and don't forget to click that notification icon so you'll be notified of future content. I've had some questions regarding the difference between using an SSD and using the Qtier on the QNAP NAS, so I wanted to try to see if we could answer that and hopefully clarify some of the confusion. So we'll be going through a walkthrough of how to set each one of them up, and we'll also do an overview of what the key differences are. So to get started, I want to walk you through a chart that will step us through kind of the key differences of how data flows and the major differences between Qtier and using a SSD as a cache. So to better illustrate kind of the data flow and how your QNAP unit uses your SSD, I kind of worked up this chart to kind of give us an idea of the key differences between the two, because there's a lot of similarities, but there's also some key differences that kind of make them unique. So let's start with the cache. So when data is written to the cache, as you can kind of see here, the data is transferred to the SSD cache so that it will give you the performance, obviously, of the SSD and not your physical hard drives. At some point shortly after the process, and in some cases during the process, that data is duplicated onto your cold storage or your hard drive. So the data actually appears in both locations. So if we look at our example here, where we have the SSD 1 terabyte and hard drives 5 terabyte of our array, we still only have 5 terabytes of usable storage. And as I mentioned, the data is actually duplicated in both locations. And this is kind of ideal for applications like VMs or databases where, it continuously will hit the cache for data. The one thing it's kind of unique to this, well, it's not really unique, but it's one of the features of the cache is that it's actually selectable by volume. So if you have thick volumes or multiple volumes on your NAS unit, you don't have to cache them all. You can select which ones get cached and which ones don't. And we'll walk through that example here in just a little bit. In contrast, the Qtier works a little differently. When data is written to the SSD, much like it does with a cache, based on your settings and based on the frequency of access, your data will either stay on the SSD or on the hard drive, but not in both. For a short period of time, it may, as the data is being copied or moved. But the final resting point is that the data is on one media type or the other. And because Qtier actually integrates in your storage pool, you actually get the accumulation of storage. So if you have a 1 terabyte SSD or SSDs versus a 5 terabyte hard drive, that will be an additive number. So you'll get a total of 6 terabytes in storage. And as I mentioned, the data only exists on one media or the other. Overall, the performance is kind of sped up for everything that's every folder or volume or share that's been activated with Qtier. It gets an overall performance gain. The other thing that's unique to Qtier, which I find to be useful, is that it's share selectable, meaning I can go into just a specific share and decide which ones get the Qtier and which ones don't. Because there are certain things, for example, a large media folder where you may not want to enable the Qtier. I hope that sort of makes sense. That gives you a better overview of the two differences. And then we'll get into setting up each one of those and how the setups vary a little bit. And then we'll do some quick testing. And this will be really an inaccurate test, but it'll give you the idea. It'll give you a better idea of how they actually configure, the fact that they're actually enabled, and what difference it makes in your overall performance. But there's pros and cons to both. So let's go through the setup, and we'll talk more about each one as we set each one of those up. The first thing we're going to do is go into storage and snapshots, and we're going to see that I have 4 mechanical drives and 2 SSDs. So our job right now is to use those 2 SSDs as a cache. So to do that, we're going to go over to cache, and we're going to click on the plus, and it's going to walk us through a little bit of a wizard. So we're going to say next. Now here we got some choices to make, and it's sort of important what choices that you do make. You can pick any type of cache. You can do read-only, write-only, or read and write. For me, I like the read and write because that's where some of the overall performance comes in, is be able to actually cache the write as well. However, as we mentioned, the data resides on both the hard drives and the SSD, so you can get away with a single drive. If you're going to do a read and write, you can get away with it. However, what I would suggest you do, and here's our two SSDs, is to go ahead and pick both drives and set it up as a RAID 1, or if you really want maximum performance and you don't care about data security too much, then you can do RAID 0. My typical go-to is a RAID 1 because I want the redundancy for the entire time the data is on there. And I do the same thing. You have to do it on Qtier. It's optional on the cache. So let's go ahead and hit next. And here we can pretty much leave everything the same, except I typically click on the All I/O. The provisioning you can change if you want to. That's basically for any memory registers that get worn out over time. Over provisioning actually gives you puts some of them in reserve so they don't get written to or read from until something goes bad and then that memory is reallocated. So we'll go ahead and hit next. And here's where we select volumes that we want to cache. By default, it turns them all on. I always turn off encrypted data, so I don't like to cache encrypted data. I don't think it's a really good idea. I know QNAP's taking care of it in their own way, but I just prefer not to cache encrypted data. Let's hit next, and here's our summary. It's going to tell us it's going to make a new RAID group. It's a read and write. This is our total estimated capacity, 451 with 45 in over provisioning. So we're going to go ahead and hit create. It's going to tell me the SSDs will get creamed. I understand. And click go. So I'll probably just skip ahead here, but it doesn't take too long, maybe 2 or 3 minutes in order to do this. So I'll skip ahead until it's done. Okay, so you can see now the RAID group 2 is ready. It's showing us the cache storage. That's what we selected in an earlier step. And it's now telling me it's ready. So we're going to take that now and do a quick benchmark just to make sure that everything is working. And then we'll move on to configuring Qtier so you can kind of see the difference in different options. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so let's get into a little bit of testing. Now, this isn't really intended to show any type of, super scientific difference. It's really intended to show you that the data is faster using one method or another, and in just a baseline comparison. And at least to give us an idea that, either cache and or Qtier is actually working. Okay, so first we'll start by copying this large movie file, which is about 25 gig. And we'll paste it into the folder that has the cache. So there we go. As you can see, it's flying right along. Pretty steady at around 400 to 450. And we'll let it finish the rest of the way through so we can get a better idea. I want to quickly flip over to the other screen where you can see the graph of the hit rates taking place to give you an idea of what's happening real time with when it's being copied to the cache. So we're just about done here. And there we have it. So you can see we got a pretty good clip right around, north of 400 most of the time. So it's given us a pretty good indication of the performance, which is roughly the speed of the SSDs that are in there minus a little bit of overhead for the RAID. So it's performing pretty much at the capacity of the SSD. Okay, so now that we've kind of established a baseline for the performance of the cache and we know that it's actually doing something, let's go ahead and disable the cache and let's go ahead and walk through setting up Qtier real quick, and then we'll do a quick performance benchmark on that, and then we'll compare both of those to the baseline comparison without any SSD caching or Qtier enabled. So to kill a cache is relatively simple. It's a two-step process. So first we're going to do is actually turn this off. So let me flip over to the right screen here. Okay, so first of all, let me point out that before we turn off the cache, let me just draw your attention to the hit rate history chart. So you can see that, it did have an impact, roughly in the 60% tile. And when we look at the numbers for the non-cached file, you'll see that it's not that far off of that. It's probably a little bit less than that, but it is, there's a sort of a correlation. And obviously this is only in, what we're demonstrating here is only the performance change in the right, because we were only going one direction. The whole beauty behind the cache is that the more you use it, the better it works for you. So let's go ahead and turn this off and move on to the second phase. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off the cache. Now, turning off the cache means flushing the cache. So it's going to basically take everything off the SSD. It's going to verify it against the hard drive storage, make sure that the files are intact in there, and then it's going to go ahead and disable it. So we'll give it a few seconds and come back when this thing is completed, and I'll show you the second part of completing the cache. All right, now that the cache is flushed, now let's go through the second part of disabling and basically releasing the SSDs. So what we have to do after we disable the cache is actually come up here to Manage and hit Remove. And this is going to warn us that we're going to remove the SSDs. We're going to say OK. And there it is. So now it's basically completely released the SSDs. They're not attached to anything. They're not attached to the cache or anything else. So now we're going to reassign them to the Qtier. Okay, so let's go ahead and give Qtier a quick configure and give it just a quick benchmark, and then we'll put it all together and see what it looks like. So what we're going to head over is probably go over to the disk and or storage, either one. And what we're going to do here is go to Qtier. So we're going to say Qtier, upgrade to Qtier. And the very first thing it asks me is which storage pool. I only have one storage pool on this system. I have multiple volumes, but only one storage pool. So there's only one listed, so we'll pick that one. And then here it shows me the available SSDs to assign to Qtier. So I'm going to go ahead and pick the two SSDs. And remember, in Qtier, because of the redundancy, you have to have some RAID fault tolerance. So unlike the cache where you can live on the edge and create a RAID 0 or a single disk, in Qtier you have to have redundancy, because if you recall from the chart, the data is either on the SSDs or the cold storage hard drives, depending on access and usage. So it's not duplicated, in other words. So if you're going to have data on the SSD, there has to be some protection and redundancy there. So in essence, you have to have at least two SSDs. And you can have more. You can have 4, you can have 3 for a RAID 5. You can do whatever you want to, but there has to be at least 2. So we'll go ahead and pick the 2 and then click Next. And obviously you can have a hot spare too if you happen to have the extra disk in there, but I don't have one, so we'll just go to Next. And we talked a little bit about provisioning. It's the same process here. You're reserving some memory space or storage space for areas of the memory, the registers that no longer work or are starting to weaken. Those that data gets reallocated. So we'll go ahead and hit Next. And here's our summary. We're going to hit Finish, and it's going to tell me all services will be stopped, so I'm going to say OK. Now this takes a few minutes because it actually, as you recall from the chart, this integrates into the storage pool. In other words, it's additive. It's adding 2 drives or 1 RAID group to the storage pool. So you end up with, for all practical purposes, you combine the storage that's on your SSD and the storage that's on your hard drive. So it becomes more integral to the system. So we're going to let this finish. It takes a few minutes, and then when we come back, I'll show you how to actually configure the Qtier. And then, as we were doing before, we'll go ahead and create a quick test. Okay, so as you can see, the process is finished now. So the Qtier pool is now ready. And what we'll do here is take a quick look at it by managing it. So I want to point out a few things that are important when you're configuring your system. So the first thing is, by default, it's idling because there's nothing happening, but it's on automatic queue data tiering, which means the system's going to take care of everything. Here's a layout of what's basically happening. So you have tier 1 and tier 3. Tier 3 being your cold storage and tier 1 being your ultra high speed. The one thing I wanted to draw your attention to is the tiering on demand. Now this to me is important. It may not mean anything to you depending on your applications, but the ability to selectively turn folders on and off to me is important, because there are things that you don't want to see anywhere near the SSD that are just going to go to cold storage. You're going to copy them once and that's it. There's really no point in having the process go to your SSD and wait to be moved later. It only makes sense to go straight to the cold storage, because maybe it's a backup, maybe it's an archive, whatever the case is. So the ability to tune this to me is critical. So I like the Qtier for that reason, but as you'll see here in a minute, we'll compare the performance. So I'm going to go ahead and hit apply, and you can do this to any and all your folders. So I'm going to go ahead and just leave it the way it is right now, because I've already enabled the one that I'm going to use for testing. So let's go ahead and close this. Now we're going to go ahead and do a quick test on the performance to see how it stacks up to the cache. So I've created a new folder. I'm going to use the same exact file. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this file, drop it in the folder which has had the Qtier enabled, and let's see what happens. So you'll see it's hovering somewhere around the 350 to kind of fluctuating all over the place, roughly around 300, 350, dropping down into the high twos. So I'd say we're hitting about 300-ish for the performance. Nowhere near what the cache is doing. And again, this is a first-time copy, so there will be some differences. But the fact that it's going straight into the storage pool that's activated with Qtier, this gives you a better idea of the performance gain. Now the bottom line is both of these technologies are faster than the standard storage, and I'm going to show you that in a second. We'll compare all three. But the cache definitely has the edge on speed, whereas Qtier has the edge on storage efficiency, making the most use of your space and allowing you to incorporate those SSDs into your storage for just the critical folders. So I think there's some flexibility and use case for that. It really boils down to how you use your NAS and what you're doing with it. Like, for example, if you have a lot of use and access for a photo library, or you're doing video editing, you could probably use either one. I think for video editing, I would use the cache, and if it was for photo libraries and such, I would consider using Qtier, because it just gives you more of a full-time performance gain versus that time where it spends on the cache. So if you got something like a photo library that's being accessed all the time, it'll most likely remain on the Qtier or the SSDs. But it's really up to you. Now, if you really have a lot of SSDs in your system, you can actually do both. You can stage these. You can add a Qtier, pick your selective folders, and then you can add a cache to the entire thing. So you can mix and match a little bit. You can't double cache, and you can't go in that direction, but you can certainly set up a Qtier, create your volume, which basically expands the volume, and then add a cache to that. But that's a little bit on the edge. I probably wouldn't do that. That's just adding too many variables for me. But I think if performance is your top tier priority, I would go with the cache. And if you're looking at the best compromise or a compromise between storage and speed, then Qtier is a nice way to go. So let's wrap it all together by showing you all three at the same time so you can get an idea of the difference. In closing, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it clarifies some of the questions and the differences between Qtier and the cache. There is obviously a significant difference in performance, and as you look at these closing benchmarks, you'll kind of get an idea for yourself how much different it is. So with that, thank you very much for watching the video, and if you haven't already done so, please subscribe and click that notification icon so you'll be notified of future content. I'll let the rest of these benchmarks play out so you can kind of get an idea of how long it took. These are in real time. And I will see you on the next video.